The chandeliers sparkled overhead, casting a warm golden glow over the lavish ballroom. It was one of the most exclusive events of the year, attended by top politicians, Hollywood elites, and business moguls. The air was thick with quiet conversations, the clinking of champagne glasses, and the occasional burst of polite laughter. Among the crowd, Melania Trump moved with effortless grace, dressed in an elegant yet understated gown. Barron Trump, now taller than most men in the room, accompanied his mother, his posture straight, his expression composed. Though still young, he carried himself with a quiet confidence that made people take notice. Their presence did not go unnoticed. Some whispered behind their backs, others exchanged skeptical glances. Not everyone at this gala welcomed the presence of the Trump family, especially not the liberal elite who dominated the event. Then came the journalist, a well-known, outspoken liberal commentator, Richard Whitman. He had built his career on attacking conservative figures, and tonight he had his sights set on someone new. He smirked as he approached them, a wine glass casually swirling in his hand. "Well, well," he said, his voice dripping with mock politeness. "The youngest Trump at an event like this. I have to admit, I'm surprised. I didn't think you'd fit in with, well, this crowd." A few nearby guests chuckled, their eyes darting toward Barron, waiting to see how he would react. But Barron remained calm, his gaze steady, his expression unreadable. Melania's eyes flickered toward the journalist, sharp and assessing. She said nothing yet. Whitman continued, clearly enjoying himself. "Tell me, Barron, do you ever get to have your own opinions? Or is it just whatever Daddy tells you to think?" A hush fell over the surrounding guests. The tension in the room thickened. Barron Trump didn't react, but Melania did. Her chin lifted slightly, her piercing eyes locking onto Whitman with a look that made even the most seasoned politicians uncomfortable. The game had just begun. The air in the grand ballroom felt heavier now. Conversations had quieted, and a few guests suddenly turned their attention toward the unfolding scene. Some pretended to be engaged in conversation while stealing glances at Melania and Barron Trump, knowing something was about to happen. Richard Whitman, still swirling his wine glass, smirked as if he had already won. He had made a career out of cornering conservative figures in public settings, using sharp words to provoke a reaction. But tonight, he was playing a dangerous game, one he didn't fully understand yet. Barron Trump, standing tall, refused to take the bait. His expression remained neutral, his body language unreadable. If anything, he looked bored. That alone was enough to irritate Whitman. He wanted a reaction. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice just enough so only the closest guests could hear. "You know, Barron," he said smoothly, "some of us actually work for our success. We don't just inherit a name and a fortune. But I suppose thinking for yourself isn't exactly a family tradition, is it?" A few gasps rippled through the group of onlookers. Some exchanged awkward glances, unsure whether to laugh or pretend they hadn't heard. That was when Melania Trump moved. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't scowl or show anger. Instead, she turned toward Whitman with the kind of icy elegance that only she could pull off. Her expression didn't change, but something in her eyes made Whitman's smirk falter. She took a step forward, closing the space between them. Though she spoke softly, her words cut sharper than any raised voice could. "Tell me, Mr. Whitman," she said, her tone smooth as silk, "is your career built on humiliating young men, or just my son?" A murmur went through the crowd. The guests watching the scene unfold didn't even try to hide their interest anymore. A few liberal elites exchanged nervous glances. Whitman had pushed too far, and now he was facing someone who wouldn't be bullied into silence. Whitman let out a forced chuckle, lifting his wine glass to his lips. For the first time that evening, he seemed uncomfortable. But Melania wasn't finished. She took another step forward, her posture regal, unshaken. "You stand here," she continued, "a grown man, a respected journalist, mocking a young man simply because of his last name, Does that make you feel powerful? Silence. Whitman shifted on his feet. His usual arrogance flickered, his confidence beginning to crack. Barron remained still, watching, learning. The guests around them were no longer whispering. Some, particularly those who had laughed at Whitman's earlier remarks, now avoided eye contact with Melania entirely. Others, especially a few older gentlemen, nodded subtly respect. But Whitman wasn't done yet. He forced another smirk and straightened his jacket. He wasn't about to be humiliated by Melania Trump in front of Washington's elite. "Oh, Mrs. Trump," he said, his tone laced with mock pity. "It must be exhausting, always defending that family name." Melania tilted her head slightly, and then she smiled. A knowing, elegant smile. And that was when she delivered the line that would echo across social media the next morning. A tense stretched between them. The grand ballroom, once filled with lively conversation, now seemed to hang on Melania Trump's every word. Even the waiters carrying champagne flutes had slowed their steps, eyes darting toward the confrontation. Richard Whitman, still forcing his smirk, thought he could regain control. He had publicly embarrassed countless conservatives before. Why should tonight be any different? But he had underestimated something. Not many people had ever seen Melania Trump truly angry. She exhaled softly, as if she found him almost amusing. Then, with a grace that only she could master, she took a slow sip of her champagne and placed the glass gently on a passing waiter's tray. She was in complete control. Then she spoke. "You are mistaken, Mr. Whitman," she said, her voice smooth as glass. "It is not exhausting defending my family's name. What is exhausting is watching men like you try to tear it down simply because you cannot build something of your own." The impact of her words hit like a slap. The once smirking journalist blinked, caught off guard. He had expected anger. He had expected outrage, but he hadn't expected this. Somewhere in the room, a guest let out a quiet "oh," the kind that happens when someone witnesses a knockout blow in an argument. Barron, standing beside his mother, remained quiet, but for the first time, a small knowing smile flickered on his lips. Whitman, now visibly rattled, tried to recover. "Oh, Mrs. Trump," he said, his voice strained. "Do you really think your family's reputation is as perfect as you claim?" He chuckled, but the laughter sounded forced. Melania tilted her head slightly, as if considering his words. Then, she delivered the second blow. "Tell me, Mr. Whitman." She paused, letting the room hang on her words. "If my family is so terrible, why do men like you spend your careers talking about us?" The crowd murmured louder. Someone in the back stifled a chuckle. Even the most skeptical onlookers couldn't deny it. She had a point. Whitman's grip tightened around his wine glass. His jaw clenched, but he forced another laugh. He was losing control, and he knew it, but he wasn't ready to back down just yet. Part 4. The journalist's last attempt. Whitman was a professional manipulator. He had twisted words for years, and he wasn't about to let Melania Trump walk away victorious. With mock concern, he glanced at Barron. "And what about your son?" he asked, his voice dripping a mite falsum mitgevoel. "Doesn't it worry you, Mrs. Trump? Growing up under such a controversial name, such expectations, people will always question him." Melania blinked langsome. Then she turned to Barron, as if checking if he wanted to answer for himself, but he didn't need to. She already knew. So she looked back at Whitman, and this time, her voice turned sharp as steel. "My son doesn't need your concern. But I suggest you start worrying about your own reputation." For the first time all night, Whitman had nothing to say. The air in the ballroom was thick with tension. People were no longer pretending to have their own conversations. All eyes were on Melania. And then, it happened. A deep voice cut through the silence. "Melania." The room turned toward the entrance. And there he was, Donald Trump. The air inside the grand ballroom shifted instantly. The silence in the ballroom was deafening. Every eye was on Donald Trump. Richard Whitman, who had spent his career mocking conservatives and tearing into the Trump family, found himself caught in his own trap. He had expected Melania to get flustered, maybe even walk away. He had expected Barron to be uncomfortable, unsure of how to respond. What he hadn't expected was this. Trump took another step forward, closing the distance between them. He wasn't angry, he wasn't shouting, he didn't have to. "You call that a joke, Richard?" Trump's voice was calm, almost amused. A grown man, standing at a gala, trying to humiliate a teenager. That's not a joke, that's desperation. A few quiet gasps rippled through the crowd. Some of the guests exchanged uneasy glances, sensing Whitman's growing discomfort. The journalist let out another nervous chuckle, shaking his head. "Come on, Mr. Trump, you can't seriously." Trump held up a hand. Whitman stopped talking. "You know what's funny, Richard?" Trump continued, his smirk growing. "I don't think you even believe half the nonsense you say." Whitman's jaw tightened. The control of the conversation had completely shifted. Trump turned slightly, addressing the crowd now. "That's the thing about guys like him. They don't actually stand for anything. They just attack whoever they think will get them the most attention." Several guests nodded subtly. Even some of Whitman's usual supporters didn't seem eager to defend him now. Whitman's face darkened. He wasn't used to being the one on the defensive. "Oh, please," he scoffed, attempting to regain control. "You and your family love playing the victims. You act like you're always being targeted." Melania, still poised, raised an eyebrow. Trump chuckled, shaking his head. "Right, we're the victims." He glanced at Barron for a moment, before turning back to Whitman. "Tell me, Richard, how many times has your son had his entire life analyzed, ridiculed, and used as a political punchline?" Whitman froze. He had no answer for that. Because he knew the truth. The media had spent years tearing apart Barron Trump for simply existing. And now, Whitman had just been caught doing the exact same thing. Trump took one more step forward, his voice steady. "You don't want a conversation, Richard. You want a headline." The room erupted. Soft murmurs spread across the crowd. Trump had just exposed Whitman's game in front of everyone. Even those who had laughed at Whitman's earlier remarks were now dead silent. Whitman's confidence was crumbling fast. He knew the second this moment hit social media, he would be the headline. And not in the way he wanted. For the first time that evening, Richard Whitman had nothing to say. The man who had spent years tearing into conservative figures, crafting headlines with sharp words, was now standing in silence. His usual confidence had vanished. Melania Trump took a step forward. Her movements were slow, deliberate. The sound of her heels against the marble floor was the only noise in the room. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to argue. With her piercing gaze fixed on Whitman, she spoke calmly. "Men like you will never understand men like my son." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Whitman flinched. He tried to maintain his smirk, but it was clear to everyone in the room he had lost. This wasn't just a conversation anymore. It was a moment he would never escape. Melania turned to Barron, resting a hand on his arm. Without another glance at Whitman, she walked away, her posture as composed as ever. Barron followed without hesitation. Near the entrance, Donald Trump had been watching the exchange. As his wife and son passed him, he took a final look at Whitman. His voice was steady, almost amused. "Good luck explaining this one tomorrow." And with that, he turned and left. By the next morning, the entire exchange had spread across news networks and social media. The footage was everywhere. Political analysts debated it. Supporters praised Melania's response, calling it one of her strongest public moments. Even critics had to admit she had handled the situation flawlessly. Richard Whitman refused to comment. His usual allies were quiet. The moment had spoken for itself. One thing was clear. The attempt to humiliate Barron Trump had backfired. And this time, the whole world had seen it happen. If you enjoyed this story, Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. What do you think about Melania's response? Was the journalist out of line, or did he get what he deserved? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more powerful stories like this, hit the like button and share this video with your friends. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one. At the entrance, Donald Trump stood tall, his unmistakable presence commanding attention. He hadn't been scheduled to attend this event, but here he was arriving at the perfect moment. The elite guests, many of whom had been smirking or exchanging quiet glances earlier, suddenly adjusted their expressions. Some straightened their postures. Others, particularly those who had just laughed at Richard Whitman's remarks, now looked uneasy. For the conservative guests in the room, however, this moment was golden. They had seen Melania handle the confrontation with absolute grace, but now they knew things were about to escalate. Richard Whitman, the smug journalist who had spent the past several minutes trying to humiliate Barron Trump, froze. His fingers tightened slightly around his wine glass, though he quickly masked his unease with a smirk. Melania, poised as ever, didn't turn around. She simply held Whitman's gaze as if giving him one last chance to retreat before it was too late. But Whitman wasn't that smart. Still smirking, he cleared his throat and turned toward Trump. "Mr. Trump, welcome to the gala," he said, feigning politeness. "We were just having a friendly discussion." Donald Trump didn't respond right away. Instead, his gaze moved from Whitman to Melania, then finally to Barron. His son stood tall, his expression composed, but Trump saw everything he needed to in Barron's eyes. Then he spoke. His voice wasn't raised, but it carried the weight of someone who was used to commanding a room. "Is that right, Richard?" Trump said, tilting his head slightly. "A friendly discussion?" A few guests shifted uncomfortably. Whitman forced another laugh, shaking his head. "Oh, come on, Mr. Trump. Surely even you can take a little joke." Wrong move. Trump's expression didn't change. He just let the words hang in the air for a moment, long enough for everyone to feel the weight of them. Then finally, he spoke again. "Tell me, Richard." Trump took a slow step forward. "How many of you media guys have made a career off joking about my family?" Silence. Whitman opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Melania remained motionless. Barron, standing beside her, kept his posture strong, steady. And yet, for the first time that evening, Whitman looked like the one who didn't belong. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. What do you think about Melania's response? Did she handle it the right way, or should she have done more? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more powerful stories like this, hit the like button and share this video with your friends. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.